So now we get to our two materialists. Right? The two materialists are going to be, in turn, Gilbert Ryle, who is our epiphenomenalist, and then J.J.C. Smart, who is our eliminativist, or reductionist, if you want to put it in those terms. Let's start with Ryle. Right. So Gilbert Ryle was a 20th century philosopher born 1900, died 1976. Teacher of the philosopher Dan Dennett. Uh, there should be like a TED Talk in a link for one of Dan Dennett's own views in um, his in the lecture notes. His book Consciousness Explained is a really good and well written, enjoyable read on functionally eliminativism. Right? So Ryle was an epiphenomenalist who said that the mental is an emergent feature of the physical, right? And that functionally neural activity produces things like beliefs, emotions, etc. However, despite that, and despite these things arising from neural activity, they can't be fully reduced back down to it, right? Because they're kind of a complex of a whole bunch of neural activity going on at once, basically. So the consciousness, which would be the neural activity, is not the same as its content, right? This is the division that Dan Dennett, Ryle's last great student, made. All right. So, to understand his position of epiphenomenalism, you must also understand his idea that Cartesian dualism, right, is what he called the official doctrine, right? Kind of subconsciously, because of how radical Descartes' own works were, we've uh, within philosophy and within everyday life, we tend to think of it, we tend to think of the mind in terms of dualism, right? We separate out the mental from the physical. And he says that this is kind of based off of a category mistake, right? Which is, category mistake is assuming incorrectly that two different things exist in the same way just because they share similarities, right? An example of this would be the believing that Oxford, the town, operates by the same rules as Oxford, the university. Even though Oxford, the university, is part of Oxford, the town, they operate on completely different rules. And again, it's also a good representation of this idea of epiphenomenalism as well, because Oxford University was built before Oxford, the town, was. Right? That's the actual history. Right? They built the university. It was meant to be a university town, a university alone, and then a town built around it. Right? But the laws of the the rules for the university and its operating procedures are quite separate from the rules and laws for the town of Oxford, or city, really. I hesitate to call it a city. It's quite small. Um, Side note, if you're ever traveling through the UK in late June, early July, last week of June, I think it is, um, last weekend of June, first weekend of July, one of those two, stop by Oxford. They have an annual Alice in Wonderland themed weekend, right? Whole bunch of events. It's the home. It's where Lewis Carroll, or Charles Ludwig Dobson, as he's actually as his actual name was, wrote the stories, and they have museums, plays, a whole bunch of things. Pretty cheap too. It's a lot of fun. Um, that aside, right? So based off of this idea of a category mistake, right? Um, that these two different things operate in the same way. Right? Um, Ryle's not decrying the idea that the mental is different from the physical in that it's not fully reducible back down to it, but he is saying that it's nothing special, right? This is why he called the mind-body problem the ghost in the machine, because the mind-body problem operates off of dualism and assumes that something like a ghost, right, which is immaterial and conscious and can perceive, right, can go into a machine, right, which is physical, composed of gears, it's non-conscious, can't perceive or move on its own, right? That's the idea, that it can't move on its own. And then the ghost going in the machine is able to move things around, right? Suddenly it goes from being a ghost to a poltergeist, right? Randomly. And that just doesn't make sense, according to Ryle. Right? Instead, it's better to think of the mind in the sense of it being a machine, and the machine, like a watch, right, is just a whole bunch of gears and everything. But the products of the machine, say, like a computer program, right, or a computer. Let's use a computer as an analogy, right? Um, Computer is just all the hardware, right, and software, right? But its ability to run and actually perform all of that is only capable because of the interaction of all the parts, right? But those parts can't be fully reduced down to any one aspect of the computer. One aspect of the computer breaks down, then it still will run, it just won't do certain things. Right? Make sense? Okay. So that's the epiphenomenalism. Now, for J.J.C. Smart, Smart was born in 1920 and he died in 2012. He actually died after I learned about him in my intro to philosophy class, so that was a change I had to make in my notes for these lectures. Just weird little side note. It's not something that often happens in an intro to philosophy class, since we typically talk about long dead guys. Right. So again, Smart was an eliminativist, and he said that the mind is nothing more than the neural processes of the body, brain, right? And is completely reducible back down to these neural processes. It's eventually we'll be able to come to a comprehensive understanding of the mind once we have a complete understanding of just how the brain works. And there's nothing over and above the mind that is, nothing over separate with regards to the mind that, sorry, there's nothing that the mind is that the brain is not. Let's put it that way. So, what appears to be mental states are just your brain states, right? That's something he said. Sensations are nothing over and above the brain processes, just as lightning is nothing over and above an electrical discharge due to an ionization of water of clouds of water vapor in the atmosphere, right? They're one and the same. Once we can have a complete physical description of what goes on to produce the experience of this shade of blue, we know how we get blue, and that's all that blue is. Right? That's J.J.C. Smart's position. Right? To clarify it a bit, I suppose. Right. Smart's position is rather akin to saying that most people argue that, or Smart's position is saying that it's ludicrous to say that Clark Kent and Superman are two separate people. Just because no one comes on to the fact that Superman or Clark Kent is Superman doesn't mean that Clark Kent isn't Superman. Right? To say that Clark Kent isn't also Superman, that they're not completely identical with each other, is to say that the moment that he puts his red underwear on his outside and ties his blanket around his neck, he gains superpowers. Right? But no, Clark Kent always has those powers on hand. Just because he doesn't use them doesn't mean that they're not there. Right? They're always a part of him. Right? Whether he's acting as Superman or mild-mannered daily reporter Clark Kent. Right? In the same way, to say that the mind is somehow something more than the brain, the body, is completely ludicrous. They're identical to each other. Just because we haven't seen the brain in all of its glory and sussed out all of its superpowers doesn't mean that it doesn't have them. Right? It's kind of stupid to assume that they're separate, according to Smart. And that's everything we have for the mind-body problem.